Sunflower Electric Power Corporation, cooperative members working together to generate power so you can enjoy the benefits of life in central and western Kansas. Sunflower Electric Power Corporation, energy done right.
Good evening. My name is James Lambert. I'd like to welcome everyone here this evening and those of you that are watching us on the live stream. I am the board chair for the Salina Area Chamber of Commerce, and I'm one of the co-moderators for this evening's Candidates Forum. The forum is sponsored by the Salina Area Chamber of Commerce and the League of Women's Voters. It features candidates from the Kansas House of Representatives 69th District. Printed profiles by the Chamber on all the candidates can be found at the Chamber office, on the Chamber's website at www.salinakansas.org, the County Clerk's Office, the Salina Public Library, and the candidates also completed questionnaires for the Salina League of Women's Voters. Those are available at the League's website, which is www.lwvsalina.org. This forum by the Salina Media Connection is recorded by Smoky Hill Public Television and is being recorded for future viewings. We'd like to thank everybody for coming tonight, the candidates, the media members, and for those of you who have observed our safety protocols because of all the conditions going on with COVID-19. We appreciate that very much. We would like to thank the Salina Community Theater for allowing us to utilize their space and their technical assistance this evening. Our candidates in the first session tonight are Ryan Holmquist and Clark Sanders from the 69th District. At this time, I'd like to introduce my co-moderator, Amy Adams from the Salina League of Women's Voters, and Amy's going to review your formats for the rules for tonight's forum. Thank you, Amy.
Good evening. I'm going to quickly review the format and rules. Each candidate will start with a 1-minute opening remark. We will alternate questions between the candidates. We will start out with a section of questions from our media panel, and then we will move into a section of questions submitted by the public. Candidates will have 1 minute to answer questions. The candidates will also offer 1-minute closing remarks. At this time, we'll move on to the candidates' opening remarks. Let's start with Mr. Holmquist.
Good evening. I'm Ryan Holmquist. I'm a fifth-generation Kansan, and I'm a farmer and rancher. My family is still on the original homestead that we've had in the family in Salina County for 152 years. I have degrees from Bethany College and KU, and I have been the choir teacher at Salina Central High School for the past 13 years. I'm running because for too long, working families have worked their jobs and tried to raise their kids, pay bills, and barely get by, when at the same time, corporations and billionaires receive tax cuts and breaks. We have to prioritize working families in Topeka and do so by eliminating the sales tax on groceries, expanding Medicaid, reducing cost of child care, and maintaining constitutional public school funding. Thank you.
And now for opening comments from Mr. Sanders.
My name is Clark Sanders. I'm the Republican running for House District 69. I've been in Salina since 1985. Even when I took a brief hiatus working in South Dakota, I maintained my residence in Salina. So I've been on the radio for 34 out of the last 35 years here in Salina. Recently semi-retired this past April. I'm conservative. I'm 100% pro-life. I'm endorsed by the Kansans for Life PAC. I'm 100% pro-Second Amendment. I'm endorsed by the NRA of Kansas with their highest rating for a non-incumbent. I'm pro-deregulation. I'm 100% in favor of letting local governments decide things that affect their citizenry, and I'm pro-President Trump. Now, if these are things that are important to you,
Thank you, candidates. At this time, I'd like to introduce the media panel for their questions that they'd like to pose to the candidates. First, I have Paul Kirkwood from Salina Media Connection, Mr. Todd Pittenger from Rockingham Radio, and Mr. Charles Rankin from the Salina Journal. With that, gentlemen, here at this time, you can ask your questions. Whoever would like to go first.
Oh, sure, I'll go first. I'd like to thank the candidates for being here and having an honest and open discussion with the populace. My first question is, if state legislators do not, like ordinances city and county commissioners establish, if there is a conflict, are you supportive of legislation maintaining or overruling local ordinances?
Who answers first?
Whichever one of you wants to go first.
I support home rule for communities, and I think that our local officials are perfectly capable of making decisions for their communities.
the answer to your question is absolutely not. I agree with Ryan on this. Local entities of government, even when I don't agree with them, are the people who should be making the decisions for their local people. And I mean, I think it was just today I heard Governor Kelly talking about wanting to have a statewide mask mandate. That's absolutely the wrong approach. This one-size-fits-all approach that she's advocated until the legislature was able to establish a groundwork for not letting her do whatever the heck she wanted was a good thing. But I'm 100% in favor of home rule.
Thank you both. Next question, please.
We're in the midst of the 7th month of the COVID pandemic. Data, the very latest data from the Kansas Department of Health and Environment in terms of new cases and percent positive test rates continues to suggest community spread is still prevalent, especially now in rural Kansas. How would you assess the state's response to the pandemic so far? Has the state did enough, not done enough, or they have done what about they should be doing? What's your assessment of the state's response to the pandemic?
The state tried to lock local communities down. That was not the proper response. Everybody has agreed from the beginning that what we need is a vaccine and what we need is a therapeutic, and President Trump is working very hard to get those two things done. I think by all accounts, if not by the end of November, by the end of the year, we'll have a vaccine which will go a long way toward solving the problem. We also are well on the way to having a therapeutic. The state's role is, the state's been given a lot of money from the federal government, and the state's role should be to distribute that money as equitably and as quickly as possible.
The state's response thus far has been somewhat mixed. I was not super in favor of some of the early things that were adopted by the governor, but I did appreciate the fact that the statewide mask mandate at least was left up to city and county officials throughout the state, and that they were able to decide for themselves. So our county commissioners and city commissioners made their own decisions here in Salina. There is some funding that needs to be distributed amongst cities and counties to help with COVID response. We need to make sure that the Labor Department has proper technology to process unemployment claims. That has been an issue, and that's something that I will work very hard on in Topeka.
Thank you. Next question, please.
In the midst of this pandemic, healthcare is a really important issue for Kansans. Oklahoma and Missouri voters this year voted to expand Medicaid, so all 4 surrounding states by the end of next year will have expanded Medicaid. What are your thoughts on the topic of expanding Medicaid in Kansas, and how do you think that healthcare can be improved by it?
Mr. Holmquist.
I absolutely support Medicaid expansion. Working Kansans who struggle with entry-level jobs that provide no health insurance need access to affordable health care so that we can have a healthy, strong workforce, and our economy needs a healthy workforce to thrive. And my opponent, like Sam Brownback, does not support Medicaid expansion. We have to do everything that we can, along with, by the way, with our previous question to the coronavirus response, expanding Medicaid will allow people who need immediate health care and the ability to have health insurance and to get it.
Mr. Sanders.
I do not support Medicaid expansion. It's too expensive. We can't afford it. I don't know how Mr. Holmquist would propose to pay for it, but we simply can't afford it. Medicaid expansion, to break it down to its most common denominator, is an expansion of Obamacare, which is something we do not need to expand. We need to replace and repeal Obamacare. And I was a little bit flabbergasted to read on Ryan's Facebook page the other day that I'm supposedly somehow opposed to pre-existing conditions not being covered. I think he said that I'm in favor of allowing insurance companies to kick people off pre-existing conditions. That's awfully strange, seeing as I'm a guy who is married to a woman for 40 years who had a bout with cancer 24 years ago. And so we need to cover pre-existing conditions.
Thank you. Next question, please.
Would you support the formation of a non-partisan district reorganizing committee rather than gerrymandering new districts in the upcoming legislative session?
Mr. Sanders.
The legislature failed miserably 10 years ago in the issue of redistricting. They couldn't get it done, and it ended up being decided by the courts. No, I do not favor a commission for that. The Kansas Constitution stipulates that the job of redistricting falls to the Kansas legislature, and it ought to be the Kansas legislature who are making these decisions. And we need to work together to come up with a fair and equitable way to do this. I'm not opposed to looking at computer models to figure out what is fair and right, but this is not for a commission, this is for the Kansas legislature.
Mr. Holmquist.
May I remind my opponent that pre-existing condition coverage is part of the Affordable Care Act, which you just said that you would like to repeal. So what I am hearing is that would remove protections for people with pre-existing conditions. Okay. With regard to the current question, I would definitely support an independent redistricting commission because, as we saw in 2010, partisan bickering between two factions of the Republican Party led to the federal courts drawing our boundaries 2 days before the candidate filing deadline. And it's also important that Salina not be split into 3 or 4 districts so that we can maximize our impact in Topeka.
Thank you, Mr. Holmquist. Next question, please.
With the pandemic, a lot of people are out of work, a lot of people looking for jobs. Initially, at the national level, there was some help for the unemployed. That expired in July. The two sides have not been able to come together for another package. Though the state is offering a little bit of assistance right now to the unemployed, how should the state help unemployed Kansans? Should we offer them more? Are we doing enough? What should the state do to help those unemployed in Kansas in lieu of the federal government having a package?
Mr. Holmquist.
The first thing that I would advocate for are tax programs for small businesses who've fallen behind on their tax payments to the state. Give them some time to catch up. Let them pay their tax bills without any onerous penalties or interest. And additionally, I have a proposal that if employers, schools, churches, or nonprofits hire new workers or give them raises, that I would like to provide a 20% tax credit on the increase in payroll expenses up to $5,000. So if a church wanted to start or expand a daycare, which is also a big issue, they'd get that 20% tax credit for hiring new people to staff it. Helps to incentivize businesses and expands our workforce.
Mr. Sanders.
There is absolutely no way that the state can afford to pay for even 10% of what my opponent is talking about. The best thing that the state can do is to get out of the way and let us get back to work and get everybody back to work. And that's how this problem is going to be solved. You know, there's not a government solution for everything. And I will mention that my opponent completely forgot to mention that when it comes to repealing Obamacare, about the replacement part. It needs to be repealed and it needs to be replaced. And when it's replaced, pre-existing conditions need to be a part of it. I've never said anything to indicate I'm opposed to having pre-existing conditions. I've never once said anything that I'm in favor of allowing insurance companies to kick people off if they have pre-existing conditions.
Thank you. Next question, please, from the media.
Broadband internet access has been a pretty big necessity as people have been working from home, as schools have been moving to offsite or to hybrid models. What role do you feel that the state government has in expansion of broadband internet access to rural communities and to underserved urban communities?
Mr. Sanders.
This is a great issue, and this is something that I think the state can have a role in. Yes, in the world we live in today, access to broadband is absolutely essential. And what exactly the solutions are for that, I'm not sure, but I will tell you this. I will support anything that is reasonable about expanding broadband. It definitely needs to be a high priority issue.
Mr. Holmquist.
There are plans in place to do that. There are current solutions being worked on. Part of the Kansas Rural Revitalization Initiative is specifically a program to bring broadband internet access to rural and outlying communities.
Thank you. Next question from the media, please.
Last year, a bill was introduced in the Ag Committees to give tax relief to farmers who develop carbon sequestration projects. Would you support promoting this type of climate legislation?
Mr. Holmquist.
Absolutely. And many farmers, may I say, including our own operation, already do carbon sequestration by doing practices like no-till and by planting cover crops. Those are incredible incentives that will help us keep and produce a safe and abundant food supply in our state, and a food supply that we need to increase production on as we are exporting those commodities to other states and to other countries overseas. I absolutely support such a program.
Thank you, Mr. Holmquist. Mr. Sanders.
Could I have the question restated, please?
Oh.
Yes.
Last year, a bill was introduced in the Ag Committees to give tax relief to farmers who develop carbon sequestration projects. Would you support promoting this type of climate legislation?
I'd have to see exactly what that bill was about. The climate is cyclical. I don't think there's any doubt about that. The climate is cyclical. I'm in favor of giving tax credits, so I could definitely take a look at that and might be able to support that. But the main thing that we need to understand about the climate, it is cyclical. And I don't know what kind of a burden this would put on the farming community, so I don't know.
Thank you. Next question from the media, please.
I live in the 69th district, so both of your names will be on my ballot. Also on my ballot and everybody else's ballot will be the question, should we fund a new jail here in Salina and Saline County? I know on the surface that's not a state issue, but the issue is overcrowding, not just in the Saline County Jail, but in jails across our state. At the state level, what can you do to help with that problem?
Mr. Sanders.
Sentencing guidelines, I think that obviously that there are too many people spending time in jail that are nonviolent offenders, and I think that we should work very hard to eliminate the need that we seem to feel is to send a lot of people to jail who frankly don't need to be there. In fact, we have a local program here in Salina, Surge, which is a restitution program for offenders that might not even involve any jail time. And so I think sentencing guidelines, a revision of that so that not so many people are eligible, if you will, for jail.
Mr. Holmquist.
We have to remember that the failed Brownback tax experiment produced cuts to corrections and to law enforcement, and that our police have had to do so much more, like serve as mental health professionals and sometimes get put in situations where they are under-equipped and undermanned. We have to make sure that we are in a position as a state to provide that kind of funding, as well as we have to, like my opponent says, reduce some sentencing guidelines. Most people, as we know, are in jail due to substance abuse, and it would be cheaper to treat them for those addictions rather than create a revolving door in and out of jail.
Thank you. Next question from the media, please.
Barring federal aid, what do you feel the state should do to tackle the likely budget shortfall that will be coming next year with the pandemic? And what other revenue sources should it look at to accomplish this, such as legalizing cannabis or legalizing sports betting?
Mr. Holmquist.
Without seeing any year-end revenue numbers and without knowing what relief may or may not come from Congress, it might be irresponsible of me to speculate on such a thing. Revenues have been down. That's true for several months in a row. However, in the month of August, we know that revenues were almost close to normal again. And we are still a long way off from the end of the year. Some of the ways that we can make up revenue is with online sales taxes from online entities, out-of-state entities, medicinal marijuana, and also legalized sports betting.
Mr. Sanders.
So we're going to be somewhere $1 billion in the hole, maybe even more in the hole. And if we fund some of these things that my opponent is talking about, it could approach $2 billion. Yes, legalized sports betting, that should be happening. I don't know necessarily how medicinal marijuana would really aid in the tax hole, but I'm in favor of medicinal marijuana. There are a number of measures that are going to have to be looked at, but the bottom line is we're going to have to be cutting spending. And we tend to be addicted to government, and we've got to get ourselves off of that addiction. We've got to be free market, and we've got to let the free market work.
Thank you. Next question from the media, please.
Given the fact that the Ogallala Aquifer covers 175,000 square miles and is shared by 8 states, how should the state legislature address the loss of water in the aquifer?
Mr. Sanders.
Well, we need to ensure that we're getting our fair share, and that's been a problem in the past. We know for a fact that Nebraska has, because they're upstream from us, have taken more of the water than they have a right to. Derek Schmidt, our Attorney General, has been great about fighting this, and we have won in court, but we need to make sure that we get the water that's due to us.
Mr. Holmquist.
We need to incentivize no-till crops and dryland crops being planted. Farmers need to do what they need to do, and they need to be able to have successful operations, but the draining of the aquifer is a huge problem.
Thank you. Next question from the media, please.
At the state level, how would you address or handle the issue of racism and police brutality? First of all, do you think it's an issue? I know here locally in Salina there is a movement of sorts for maybe a citizen review board to offer some oversight of the Salina Police Department, but at the state level, do you think that's an issue, a statewide issue, and if so, how would you handle it?
Mr. Holmquist.
First, we must support racial minorities who don't receive the same level of justice that other members of our societies do. We must root out racism wherever it exists, and we must work hard with our law enforcement. But also because of the brownback cuts, again, as I've said, police have had to do a lot more, and we have some things that we need to talk about. I think that we can hold law enforcement to a high standard at the same time that we hold them in high regard. And my opponent has lied repeatedly about some of my stances on these issues.
Mr. Sanders.
I don't know that I've commented on any of your stances on these issues. I haven't really brought up a race at all in this campaign. I know we have 3 great black guys running for state legislature. Rashad Young and Willie Dove and Patrick Penn, who I've had the chance to get acquainted with. I would certainly hope that the voters of the districts that they're wanting to serve in vote them into office, because they would be able to bring a perspective that maybe we don't have at this time. I don't like the idea of hate crimes, because that gets into a thought police situation. I mean, a crime's a crime. And it doesn't matter whether it's committed against a white guy or a black guy or an Asian guy or anybody else. Crimes are crimes. And we certainly need to fully support and fund the police. And when we come across bad apples, they need to be removed.
Thank you. Next question from the media, please.
Many people in Kansas and across the nation see a divided and polarized country right now. If you're elected, how do you plan to bridge this divide in your role as a legislator, and how do you work across the aisle with colleagues that differ from you?
Mr. Sanders.
Well, I'm certainly in favor of working across the aisle when we have some sort of a basic agreement. For example, Ryan here has said that his top priority is what he responded on the questionnaire to the chamber, was that removing the taxes from groceries. I can absolutely support him on that, and I'll be willing to work with anybody in the legislature who wants to remove the sales tax from groceries. Now, we've talked a little bit kind of bantered back and forth about the abortion issue. I'd like my opponent tonight to say that he would absolutely support the Value Them Both amendment, and that he would stand alone as the only Democrat who would be in favor of trying to get Value Them Both onto a ballot and voted into the state constitution.
I don't know if partisanship is a huge issue, but we have a do-nothing legislature that often spends their time debating resolutions about laws passed in New York State rather than dealing with the problems of Kansans, and I will work with members of both parties to advance legislation that will help working Kansans. And incidentally, Mr. Sanders, you have lied again. You are peddling a stream of lies, and there is, according to your mail, there is no such thing as a post-birth abortion, and I abhor partial birth abortions. And it is so clear that your campaign is so bereft of ideas that could help working people that you just lie. So what you're hiding is that you want to force women who are victims of rape and incest to bear their rapist babies, and your support for the Value Them Both amendment unequivocally demonstrates this.
Next question from the media, please.
If the Affordable Care Act were to be overturned at the national level, what steps would you take to help remedy this in Kansas?
Mr. Holmquist.
Well, first of all, I don't support overturning the Affordable Care Act, and one of the biggest impediments to entrepreneurship in Kansas and our country is the access to affordable health insurance. If the Attorney General and his supporters, like my opponent, have their way, the court will invalidate the ACA, and everyone with health insurance from the marketplace will find themselves without it, especially those with pre-existing conditions, who will be left out in the cold and facing bankruptcy because of having to pay for those conditions.
Mr. Sanders.
Obamacare needs to be repealed. Obamacare needs to be replaced. Nobody is talking about kicking people off of their insurance if they have a pre-existing condition. Now, if Ryan here is as gung-ho about wanting to pass meaningful legislation about abortion as he says he is, then he needs to pledge tonight to support the Value Them Both amendment, a constitutional amendment that would give the legislature, if we get approval from the people of Kansas, to make meaningful legislation about abortion. If he doesn't support that, then that means he's not interested in being able to fulfill a role as a legislator, making laws relative to abortion. I ask him to pledge to do that tonight.
Thank you. Next question from the media, please.
We touched just briefly on the topic of marijuana. I want to broach it a little more. We've opened maybe cracked the window a little bit with some hemp, making it legal for growing some hemp here in Kansas. What are your thoughts on, we discuss medicinal marijuana, but marijuana itself, decriminalizing marijuana in Kansas? Would you be in favor of that?
Mr. Sanders.
I think we've got to take this a step at a time. I do support medicinal marijuana. There's too much evidence that it helps too many people. But before we go into decriminalizing marijuana altogether, I would like to see what the results of medicinal marijuana are.
Mr. Holmquist.
Decriminalization would be very important especially to those people who are serving sentences in jail who could get out and get treatment instead. And medicinal marijuana, of course, with safety procedures so that people who are under a certain age don't have access to it and that it is regulated at the state level, I think could be a huge asset to all sorts of people who have certain conditions, such as veterans with PTSD or cancer patients. I would strongly support that.
Thank you. Next question, please.
What do you believe is the most important issue for people in Salina, and how do you plan to take that issue to Topeka with you?
Mr. Holmquist.
I have knocked thousands of doors and talked to thousands of people in the last 5 months, 7 days a week, talking to people in the 69th District. And the single biggest issue that they have, that they talk to me about, is health care. And we can solve that issue by expanding Medicaid.
Mr. Sanders.
The single biggest thing that we can do is support home rule so that those people who are our city commissioners, our county commissioners, our USD 305 school boards members can make decisions that are pertinent to the city of Salina as the conditions on the ground warrant.
Thank you. Next question from the media, please.
Well, I am out of questions. I guess I did have one that I thought of in the meantime, although it is more pointed towards a particular candidate. I don't know if that's allowed or if they have to be answered by both. Both? Okay, then I'm out of questions.
Okay.
I've heard each of you talk about what is wrong with the other one. Can you tell me something that you admire about your opponent as opposed to what you don't like about your opponent?
Mr. Sanders.
Absolutely. Ryan Holmquist is put his hat in the ring. He's running to be a state representative. He's working very hard. Campaigns are hard, and he's done that. I also know that he is an award-winning music teacher, and I hope that the students at Salina Central get to benefit from his expertise in teaching music during the second semester.
I certainly admire Mr. Sanders' commitment to his community, having served in the media at KSAL, which extends itself out to lots of community events and functions, and many of them for many good causes. And that speaks to his character as a member of our community.
Thank you both. And thank you to Mr. Kirkwood, Mr. Pittenger, and Mr. Rankin. This will conclude our questions from the media, and I'm going to turn it over to my co-moderator, Amy Adams, and she will address the questions from the audience. Thank you very much.
Right. So I have several questions that were submitted by the public ahead of time. We'll start with a ground level question. Why are you seeking this office, and what do you hope to accomplish? Let's see, we'll start with Mr. Holmquist.
As I said in my opening statement, I'm running because for too long, families are trying too hard to get by, and they are just barely getting by. And my priorities are eliminating the sales tax on groceries, reducing the cost of child care, getting people health care that can't afford it by expanding Medicaid, and making sure our schools are adequately and fully funded.
Mr. Sanders.
I would like to get value them both on an August ballot. That's certainly something important to me. And again, I call on Mr. Holmquist to commit to joining me in that effort, as I am more than willing to join him in the effort to eliminate sales tax on groceries. But we all have heard about the games they play in Topeka. We had a session that was literally 5 minutes short of being 24 hours, despite the fact that there is a law in the legislature that no session should go past midnight, but of course when things get going too long, they just suspend that rule. We have got to fix the way we legislate. And I want to get on the Rules Committee and learn what all the rules are, and then figure out a better way to do the work that Kansans need done at the legislative level more efficiently.
Thank you. We received several questions about taxes from the community. I will start with a general question. Rank and order what taxes you would cut. And we'll start with Mr. Sanders.
Number one, sales tax on groceries. I would cut that. Number two, I would place a lid on how much a property can be valued from one year to the next. Now this ties in directly with property tax because as we know, property taxes can be a shell game. You can keep the mill levy the same, but you can raise the value. Well, there needs to be something in place that says the value of a piece of property can only go up a certain percentage, 2%, 5%, but not some of these wild swings we see that a property that has had no improvements on it be at one level one year and then increase 10, 15, 20% the next year. So I think that we've got to have a lid on how much a property valuation can go up.
Thank you. Mr. Holmquist?
Sales tax is the number one, and eliminating the sales tax on food. That is my primary campaign issue. The second is property taxes. We just have to protect Kansas taxpayers from surprise tax increases. And at the very bottom would be income taxes.
Thank you. One of the most difficult things for working families is to find affordable childcare. Do you support a childcare tax credit? And this will go to Mr. Holmquist first.
Absolutely. That's a cornerstone of my campaign. When Brownback bankrupted our state and didn't admit that it didn't work the way he wanted, he made huge cuts, and we lost the child care tax credit that we have. We have gotten it back to some degree. We need to double that child care tax credit because we need to make sure that working families have the ability to get affordable child care so that they can be productive members of our economy, be able to raise money for themselves and provide for their own families and children.
Thank you. Mr. Sanders?
Certainly a child care tax credit is something that needs to be looked at, but the reality of the situation that we're in is we're in a $1 billion plus hole. Maybe closer to $2 billion. So yes, that child care tax credit is definitely something that in principle I could support, but whether that's going to happen this year, I don't know, because we've got to figure out a way to dig ourselves out of this hole.
All right, thank you. The property tax lid has been discussed in the Kansas legislature for years. What is your stance on this topic? And we'll begin with Mr. Sanders.
Well, I think I articulated my point of view very clearly earlier, but again, to reiterate, I'm not for property taxes are something that the local governments decide, and they ought to be left to decide that. What I am opposed to is a county appraiser who can just arbitrarily raise the value of a piece of property by way above what the market would bear. And I'm certainly opposed to situations when we have a recent sale that didn't involve a family or a friend, that they come up with some sort of value allegedly based on properties, comparable properties. So there needs to be a lid on how much valuation can be raised.
Thank you. Mr. Holmquist?
I definitely support a property tax lid. Part of my answer to the previous question was that we can get surprise tax increases. And that's not a good thing, especially for when we're talking about farmers and ranchers who own a lot of land and then are not getting their commodities to market are not getting good prices for them, and all of a sudden are hit with a tax increase.
Thank you. Do you support eliminating various sales tax exemptions in the state of Kansas to raise revenue? And we'll start with Mr. Holmquist.
I don't like raising a sales tax in any circumstance.
All right, thank you. Mr. Sanders?
I support eliminating sales tax on groceries. That needs to be eliminated.
Thank you. Do you support expanding the earned income tax credit? Why or why not? And we'll start with Mr. Sanders.
That's something I can support. Anything that's going to be about reducing taxes is something in principle I'm in favor of. But again, I am very concerned about this hole that we find ourselves in. And if we start reducing every tax in sight, we'll never dig ourselves out of it.
Thank you. Mr. Holmquist?
Yes, we should reward hard work by families who work 2 or 3 jobs trying to raise those families, and the earned income tax credit is a better way to help people escape poverty than simply give them a handout. Rewarding work is always a better way.
Okay, thank you. One last tax question. Consumer trends, especially during COVID, have seen a dramatic rise in internet commerce and sales. This trend is hurting local economies as revenue and taxes from sales don't stay with the local businesses and taxing entities. How can the Kansas legislature assist? Mr. Holmquist.
The Kelly administration has already started charging online sales tax from online entities. And there's already a statute in place that enables that to take place. We cannot let our local businesses die. We have to support those, and at the same time seeing that Amazon is not paying taxes. Well, there's something in place now, and we are already seeing revenue from that.
Thank you, Mr. Holmquist. Mr. Sanders?
Amazon is paying taxes. Walmart is paying taxes. I am definitely in support of anybody who does commerce on the internet paying their fair share of taxes, paying the sales taxes that the local stores, whether it be one of the big box stores or whether it be a mom and pop operation, they should all pay the taxes equally. But the fact of the matter is, this is not going to be a panacea in $1 billion plus budget hole. This would maybe account for about $30 million. And while it's good, and while we need to do it, anybody who thinks that this is going to solve our budget problems hasn't studied the numbers.
Thank you. Moving on to another topic. We've already talked about the Affordable Care Act, but what efforts would you work towards to lower the cost of health care in Kansas? Mr. Sanders?
We need to allow commerce across state lines. We need to allow competition. You know, if there's a company that operates in several states, which there are lots of those kinds of companies here in Kansas, we need to allow their insurance program to be fully funded in the state of Kansas. And if that means that somebody in Kansas is sending a check off, or a company here in Kansas is sending a check off to Georgia or Nevada or wherever, we need to allow that.
Thank you. Mr. Holmquist?
If we were to lower health costs for working people, we need to expand Medicaid. Give people the ability to see a doctor before their health condition becomes an emergency, which will result in better economic outcomes and will save money on costly interventions for those people at a later time.
Thank you. Moving on to another topic. Are you in favor of raising the minimum wage to $15 per hour? Why or why not? Mr. Holmquist.
I am not in favor of raising the minimum wage to $15. I think a good place for our economy, a good starting place would be $10. But we can also, by expanding the earned income tax credit, that's another way that we can help people who work minimum wage jobs get enough money to make ends meet.
Thank you. Mr. Sanders?
Absolutely not. I'm not in favor of expanding the minimum wage to $15 to $10 or to anything other than what it is now. And the fact of the matter is, that it ought to be people who are just starting out in their work careers, who are working in those minimum wage jobs. And if you expand, there's no such thing as just expanding the minimum wage, because if you do that, everybody has to get a raise. And for the life of me, I don't understand why the government has any role being involved in the employer-employee relationship when it comes to wages.
Thank you. Moving to budget. What do you think are the 3 most important items in the annual budget for the state of Kansas? Mr. Sanders.
Well, obviously, education is at the top of the list. I support quality education. I don't support the fact that the court took over the legislator's role and mandated a particular number, but certainly we need quality education, and it needs to be funded. Secondly, transportation. We've got to, that has got to be a budget priority in the state of Kansas. And relative to a third item, certainly economic incentive to get businesses to relocate in Kansas, like we've had a great success here in Salina recently, is something that I'd be in favor of.
Thank you. Mr. Holmquist.
Education is the number one, both public and higher education. And may I remind my opponent that the court took over the role because of over 20 plus years of lawsuits because your party didn't do their job for our kids. Secondly, roads and bridges. And 3, Medicaid. Support our seniors, pregnant women, children, as well as foster care services. We have to remember that the failed Brownback experiment resulted in more than 70 children being completely lost by the state, and we literally did not or do not know their whereabouts because of cuts made to DCF.
Thank you. Staying on the topic of budget, what is your plan to balance the budget in the 2021 session? Mr. Holmquist.
Well, I think we sort of addressed this with the media question already, but I mean, again, without seeing any year-end revenue numbers and without knowing what relief might come, we still don't know. We still don't know what's coming for us. And I think it just would be irresponsible at this point to speculate what's going to happen by January.
Thank you. Mr. Sanders?
So for those who aren't aware, it's a constitutional requirement that the governor of the state of Kansas submit a balanced budget to the legislature, and then the legislature adopts it or changes it or amends it as they see fit. So obviously it starts with the governor, in this case Laura Kelly, to submit a balanced budget, and then we'll see where we go for there. And I'd like to remind Ryan that last I heard, Sam Brownback wasn't on the ballot this time.
Thank you. Please describe your thoughts and ideas towards lessening regulatory burdens on businesses in Kansas. Mr. Sanders.
I'm sorry, again, please.
Sorry. Please describe your thoughts and ideas towards lessening regulatory burdens on businesses in Kansas.
Well, I'm very pro-deregulation. I'm absolutely pro-deregulation. Government needs to get out of the way in as much as possible and let the free market do its thing. That's where we thrive.
Thank you. Mr. Holmquist?
Well, as a farmer, I certainly understand the burdens that regulations can have on business, and I understand while some of them are onerous, I appreciate the ability to breathe clean air, drink clean water, and have ourselves a safe and abundant food supply.
Thank you. On to another topic. What statewide changes could alleviate hunger in Kansas, the breadbasket of the world? Mr. Holmquist.
Eliminate the food sales tax. Expand Medicaid and expand child care tax credits. Those 3 things combined together, people will have more money to pay for food.
Thank you. Mr. Sanders?
I agree on number 1, eliminate the food sales tax, but I also think that what we have going here in Salina, a program that was started, I don't know, 30 years ago now, I think, by Jack Parr and at the time Jane Glenn, now Jane Kramer, called Project Salina, that I've been a board member of Project Salina for a long, long time. I'm a past president of Project Salina, where we make an effort here in Salina to raise food for 5 agencies that help feed the hungry: the Emergency Aid Food Bank, the Salvation Army, the Ashby House, DVAC, and the Salina Rescue Mission. And I've also been involved, and lately, the chairman of the Super Bowl drive here in Salina. And again, these are local initiatives, and we can be a model in the state of Kansas for trying to solve this problem as best we can locally, not involving the government.
Thank you. We're drawing to the end of our time for public questions. So here's your final question for tonight. How do you feel about for-profit jails and prisons? Mr. Sanders.
That's something that I think would have to be looked at and studied. I think certainly protecting the safety of all Kansas citizens is basically the duty of governments at all level. If they're as just without any kind of oversight, I wouldn't be in favor of that, but I would be in favor of looking at proposals.
Thank you. Mr. Holmquist?
I oppose for-profits, jails, and prisons.
All right. I will turn it over to my co-moderator for the closing remarks.
Thank you, Amy. We've come to that portion of the evening where we're going to allow each candidate to have their closing remarks noted. And at this time, it's a 1-minute closing remark. At this time, we'll go to Mr. Adams. Excuse me, Mr. Holmquist.
My name is Ryan Holmquist. My priorities are eliminating the food sales tax, getting people health care that can't afford it by expanding Medicaid, reducing the cost of child care, and creating jobs for people who've lost them in the pandemic. I will bring empathetic and effective leadership to Topeka, and I ask for your vote on November 3rd.
Thank you, Mr. Holmquist. Mr.
Sanders?
Yes, sorry, Mr. Sanders.
Okay.
I thought I said it. My apologies.
My name is Clark Sanders. I'm a conservative Republican. I'm unapologetically 100% pro-life. And again, I ask Mr. Holmquist to tonight pledge to support the value of them both amendment. It's the only way he's going to have any opportunity to pass any legislation, meaningful or otherwise, relative to the abortion issue. I am 100% pro-Second Amendment. I'm endorsed by the NRA, and it didn't really come up tonight, but as most of us are aware, Mr. Holmquist recently appeared at an event of Barbara Bollier here in town, and Kansas for Life PAC says she's perhaps the most pro-abort legislator that's ever served in Kansas. I would also like to remind folks that not once, not twice, but 3 times, my opponent has donated to Bernie Sanders.
Thank you. At this time, I'll pass it back to my co-moderator, Amy Adams, for her closing remarks.
I want to thank my co-moderator and everyone this evening. Thank you to the candidates for joining us and to the viewers who are taking an interest in this race. I want to remind everyone to vote on or before November 3rd.
Sunflower Electric Power Corporation, cooperative members working together to generate power so you can enjoy the benefits of life in central and western Kansas. Sunflower Electric Power Corporation, energy done right.